There have been some events in India referred to as the Black Chapter, or Kala Adhyay, one of which is the emergency of 1975. The younger generation of this decade is less familiar with this incident. However, if you ask those who were present at the time, you will realize that it was far from small. It was one of the major events in Indian history after independence, and it was significant enough to be remembered by future generations. Before independence, the British government had its own ways of oppressing Indians. Later, it was carried on by Mrs. Indira Gandhi's government against its own citizens. Numerous people were killed, thousands were imprisoned, people were shot, and some were even forced into sterilization by the officials. Many events occurred during the emergency, which you will learn as I will explain in this video. Starting with when and why the emergency was imposed, who imposed it. What were the incidents that occurred during it? What was the reason behind it? When and why was it removed? What was the impact of the emergency on our country? So stay with me until the end of the video to learn more. And make sure you like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon. The government declared a state of emergency in 1975, but do you know what the situation was like in India at the time? What was the environment in which the emergency was imposed? Well, let's begin by learning why the emergency was declared and what was going on in India at the time. The 1971 elections were held in India, and Indira Gandhi stood against Mr. Raj Narayan, from Raebareli, Uttar Pradesh. In this image, Mr. Raj Narayan is on the right, and Mrs. Indira Gandhi is on the left, as you are probably aware. In the 1971 elections, Mrs. Indira Gandhi won with a large number of votes, becoming India's Prime Minister. Despite the fact that the people of Raebareli believed Mr. Raj Narayan was more popular and had a better chance of winning, he was defeated. And the loss made him doubt Mrs. Gandhi and their party's election strategy. As a result, Mr. Raj Narayan filed a case against Mrs. Indira Gandhi in the Allahabad High Court, claiming some irregularities during the elections that should be investigated. In this picture, we are looking at the then Justice of Allahabad Court, Mr. Jagmohan Lal Sinha. Following the filing of the lawsuit, Mr. Jagmohan Lal Sinha launched an investigation to ascertain whether or not Mrs. Indira Gandhi was responsible for any irregularities that occurred during the 1971 elections. This was one of the biggest cases after the 1971 elections. After this incident, strife escalated between Mrs. Gandhi and the Indian judiciary. However, a seed of strife was planted when the former Prime Minister, Mr. Lal Bahadur Shastri, suddenly died for an unknown reason. Stay tuned to the Explain in English channel for the upcoming videos where I will be covering Mr. Shastri's unidentified death as well. Moving on, after this incident in the case, the judiciary of India and Mrs. Gandhi were in front of each other. More cases, such as the Goloknath case, the Kesavananda case, and the Minerva Mill case, were brought to light in order to amend the Constitution. Specifically, to add new laws to our Constitution or amend the ones that already existed. These cases occurred as a result of discussions about amending the laws. And the conflict between the Indian judiciary and Mrs. Gandhi was set in motion. This is the picture of Mr. J. Prakash Narayan, who was also called J.P. Narayan. As a freedom fighter in India, he played an important role in the country's independence. After achieving independence, he abandoned politics and began living a simple life. If he had entered politics, he would have been a well-known political leader like Nehru ji or Sardar Patel, but he chose to stay in his home state of Bihar. During the 1971 election, Congress chose the slogan, Garibi Hatao, which helped them win the election. At the same time, in 1971, we were at war with Pakistan, and America halted all exports to India. India, in 1971, was categorized as a poor country and was more dependent on America. As a result of America's denial, there was a sudden increase in inflation during this period. Things were not going as planned by the Congress government, who actually won the election with the slogan, Garibi Hatao. As the years passed, inflation reached 23% in 1973 and continued to rise to 30% in 1974. People were unemployed, and because agricultural conditions were not advanced, there was a scarcity of food. Bihar was the worst affected state at the time. As a result, in 1974, students in Bihar took ownership and launched a movement to reduce the cost of goods, eliminate corruption, and create jobs. This movement was known as the Chhatra or Students' Andolan, and it included top politicians such as Lalu Prasad Yadav and Nitish Kumar. As the Chhatra Andolan movement progressed, the students made efforts to contact Mr. J.P. Narayan, a prominent personality at the time, and asked him to join them in their movement. Mr. J.P. Narayan was also fed up with the government because of the state of his home state, Bihar. It was getting worse, and the government was doing nothing but talking. Hence, Mr. Narayan joined the movement and led it, but only on the condition that there would be no violence and that it would not be limited to Bihar, but would spread throughout the country. Following Mr. Narayan's involvement, more people began to join the movement. They tried everything they could to get the Congress government to resign, but they were unsuccessful. However, the movement did not end there and continued, becoming known as the JP movement. Following the Chhatra Andolan, another movement called the Railway Andolan began in Bihar. This is the image of the Railway Andolan. The movement was led by George Fernandez, an Indian railway officer. A similar movement known as the Navnirman Andolan began in Gujarat. This movement, led by Mr. Morarji Desai and Mr. Chimnabai Patel, led to the overthrow of Mrs. Gandhi's government in Gujarat. The elections were held again in June 1975, and Mrs. Indira Gandhi's government was defeated. And suddenly, the Allahabad court issued a significant decision. In the introduction to this video, I mentioned how Mr. Raj Narayan sued Mrs. Indira Gandhi after the 1971 elections, claiming that her supporters in Raebareli violated the law and engaged in electoral malpractice. The case was being investigated by Justice Jagmohan Lal Sinha. On June 12, 1975, Justice Sinha gave his verdict that Mrs. Indira Gandhi committed electoral malpractice during the 1971 elections in Raebareli. That means Mrs. Gandhi campaigned fraudulently, government servants were also involved in the fraudulent elections, and she made use of government machinery to win the elections. She was accused of many such allegations, due to which she was removed as a member of the Lok Sabha and banned from contesting elections for the next 6 years. As Mrs. Gandhi was banned from standing in the elections for the next 6 years, her political career was on the line as the elections were to be conducted in 1976. After this verdict, on June 24, all the members of the opposition party, including Mr. Jai Prakash Narayan, and thousands of people demonstrated at Ramlila Maidan in Delhi and asked Mrs. Indira Gandhi to resign from her post. But before that happened, Mrs. Gandhi declared an emergency in India on June 25, 1975. Let's first learn what an emergency situation is. So, when the situation of emergency arises in India, it is imposed under certain conditions. These conditions are followed by the laws laid out in the Indian Constitution. Just to tell you superficially, an emergency is declared under the following 3 conditions. The first condition is when there is any danger to the country from outside. The second condition is when there is any danger to the country from the inside. And the third condition is when the financial condition of the country worsens. So the people who wrote the Constitution of India made some laws for the emergency to be imposed when there is any danger to India's unity, integrity, sovereignty, democracy, or political system, which are of 3 types. Above we mentioned the 3 conditions that an emergency can be imposed in. Now, we will cover the 3 types of emergency. The first is the national emergency, also called Rashtriya Apatkal, which is declared under Article 352. So, a national emergency is declared and there is a possibility of war with another country or when an external force or group attacks India. It is also categorized as external aggression. Moreover, it can be declared when the people of India themselves attack the country. It is also categorized as armed rebellion. It can also be declared if the government feels like Pakistan is about to attack us, or if China is about to attack us, or if the Naxalwadi of the country are about to attack us. Although the war hasn't started, if the government feels like it, an emergency can be declared in the country. This is called the national emergency, or Rashtriya Apatkal. This emergency was declared in the country during the wars with China and Pakistan from 1962 to 1968 and in 1971 during the war with Pakistan. The second is the President's rule, the state emergency or Rajya Apatkal, which is declared under Article 356. When any state government turns against the central government or does not obey the central government, a state of emergency is declared. When there was a Nav Nirman Andolan in Gujarat, a state of emergency was declared in Gujarat by the government of Mrs. Indira Gandhi. After that, the rule of the state government was removed and the central government started ruling in Gujarat. This is how an emergency is declared in any state. The third is the financial emergency, also referred to as Vittaya Apatkal, which is declared under Article 260. When there is a situation in the country where the economic condition worsens, or the country becomes financially poor, a financial emergency is declared. However, this emergency has never been declared in India. Coming back to Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the reason that Mrs. Indira Gandhi gave after imposing the national emergency is that there is some internal disorder in the country. That means, the national emergency was declared due to vague or fake internal disturbance, which later came to light that there was no such thing in the country, and the emergency was declared only for Mrs. Gandhi to save her political career. Hence, she took such a big step only for her own benefit, which is why this issue remained highly controversial in the history of India. Now take a look at this image of one of the newspapers of the time. You can see in the image that all the big political leaders like Mr. J.P. Narayan, Mr. Morarji Desai, Mr. Advani, Mr. Vajpayee, and more were thrown in jail. The leaders who wanted to create any type of movement against Mrs. Gandhi were all arrested, about whom no one had any clue, not even their friends or families. No one knew where they were kept other than the government of Mrs. Gandhi. Even after 2 months in jail, no one had permission to meet their families, they were all kept in isolation and tortured, and they were not given any medical attention when they were sick. Within 7 days of the emergency, 15,000 people were sent to jail. Even if someone came to visit them from outside, Mrs. Indira Gandhi's intelligence officers were stationed near them so that these people would not create any conspiracy against the government. Have you heard about Kalapani ki saza? What used to happen to the prisoners in Kalapani was done to the politicians in the emergency. These politicians were tortured with acts like, not letting them sleep at night, keeping them hungry, not giving them water or food, or giving them extra food and not allowing them to sleep, and asking them the same question for months about where their friends were, as many members of the opposition disappeared like Subramaniam Swamy, who fled to America overnight. At that time, there were many members who were not arrested and were being searched everywhere. In the image, we are looking at Ranjan from Kerala, who was pressed between the addresses of the machines, which broke several bones in his body. Here is the image of Mr. George Fernandes, who led the railway Andolan, which we discussed earlier. His brother Lawrence, who was in Bangalore at that time, was beaten by the police to the point where he couldn't stand for years. The members who participated in the movement were imprisoned, and their families were thrown out of the railway quarters where they were living. In Gujarat or Bihar, the students who disclosed their identity were hanged. In Delhi, there was a slum area called dwellers. When the poor raised their voice against the government, the police rained bullets on them, and lots of people died. This harsh treatment was not only for men. Women like Gayatri Devi and Vijayvargiya Scindia were also thrown in with the sick prisoners. Moreover, socialist leaders like Srialada, Mrinal Gauri, and Durga Bhagwat were kept in the lunatics asylum. Overall, around 140,000 people were kept in jail for about 1 year and 8 months without any offense. This was possible because according to the constitution, if the government feels like any person can rebel, he can be put in jail even before he rebelled. That means the person was imprisoned before and without committing any offense. Now, let's talk about how Mrs. Indira Gandhi twisted the Constitution of India. As we discussed, all the members in Parliament who were in the opposition were imprisoned. So, now in Parliament, only the members of Mrs. Gandhi's government were left. The first task that Mrs. Gandhi took was to change the verdict given by the Allahabad court in the case filed by Mr. Raj Narayan. This was the case when Mrs. Gandhi was banned from contesting elections for the next 6 years. The government of Mrs. Gandhi tried to bring a law into the Indian constitution that stated that no case could be filed against the president, vice president, prime minister, or speaker for life. That means no case will be filed against them for life on the basis of any offense. Though this law was passed in the Rajya Sabha, it was not presented in the Lok Sabha. In the Indian constitution, the 42nd Amendment, which is the toughest, is where they tried to weaken the basic structure of the constitution. An attempt was also made to damage and disturb the balance of the three organs of the government. In the first week itself, after the emergency was declared, Article 14, Article 21, and Article 22 were suspended. By doing this, the government equalized everyone in the eyes of the law. The right to guarantee safety and property and to present the arrested was withheld. After that, Article 19 was also suspended, so the freedoms of publishing, forming unions, and gathering in groups were snatched from the common people. Other than this, the Rasuka Act was also implemented, under which people who were imprisoned were not told the reason for being imprisoned. Mrs. Indira Gandhi tried to twist and make changes in the Rasuka Act to evade answering the politicians kept in jail so that they could not appeal in court. On top of that, giving information about these to the court or anyone else was also considered a crime. To take an example, if you are a relative of Mr. J.P. Narayan and you come to know that he is kept in Tihar jail, and if you told this to anyone, you will also be put in jail. So, such things were done by Mrs. Indira Gandhi and her government. They tried their best to twist the Constitution of India, which turned out to be beneficial for them during the emergency. Now, we will talk about the condition of media, newspapers, and reporters. The day before the emergency had to be imposed, all the big newspaper factories that used to print the newspapers had their electricity cut off. So, after the emergency was declared, the news of all the politicians who were arrested overnight could not reach the common people. All the newspapers were censored. For this, a person from the government was placed in the factories to check and filter news that was to be printed. And the journalist or editor who was caught publishing the critical and correct news was arrested. Take a look at this picture. This movie was made by Amrit Nahata in 1977 and was made about the event of emergency. So, the government banned the movie from release, and all the prints of the movie were burned by the police. Another movie was made by Gulzar in 1975, called Andy, which was based on Mrs. Indira Gandhi. This too was banned from the release. Apart from this, the people in Bollywood cinema were pressured to show the good of Mrs. Gandhi's government, otherwise, they were warned to be sent to jail. You all know about Kishore Kumar, who was a legendary singer in Bollywood. He was also pressured to sing the songs in favor of the government, but he didn't follow them. So, this is how the media, TV, and reporters were pressurized. Now, we will talk about how the government of Mrs. Indira Gandhi misled the people of India. The government of Mrs. Gandhi had reduced the rights of laborers. The biggest advantage of the emergency was taken by the capitalists of that time. Before the emergency, the lowest bonus for the laborers was 8.33%, which was reduced to 4% after, which means it was cut in half. Imports of goods were exempted for the promotion of the private sector, and the taxes were reduced for the big companies. MNCs were requested to invest in India, as the labor costs were reduced. Because of the reduction in labor costs, the laborers called for strikes in many places. But they were beaten up and chased away by the police. The same happened in Bengal, where 16,000 laborers called for a strike and were later imprisoned. The government used all means to violate civil rights, and the lawyers defending the misbehavior, injustice, and atrocities meted out to the citizens were also harassed. Around 42 lawyers were suspended as they tried to protest. And the worst that happened was the sterilization. In order to control the population of the country, people were forcefully sterilized. Most of the victims of forced sterilization were minorities, and the people who protested were beaten and imprisoned. The government asked for help from the people themselves, saying that if they encouraged other people to undergo sterilization, they would be given some land. Due to the greed of the land, there were some stupid people who started getting innocent people sterilized by flattering them. The couples who did not have any children and did not want any were also sterilized. The people who were old and were in their 60s and 70s were also sterilized. And the person who was leading this campaign was none other than Mr. Sanjay Gandhi. The thought of controlling the population was somewhere near right, but the method that the government of Mrs. Gandhi opted for was completely wrong. Even a movie was made on this later. Take a look at this poster. This was also banned by the government so that the common people wouldn't come to know the reality. Overall, like the British government used to oppress the Indian people, the same behavior was followed by the government of Mrs. Indira Gandhi towards their own people. After this, all the opposition came together so that they could defeat the government of Mrs. Indira Gandhi in the next election, which was called the Janta Party. After 20 months, in March 1977, the emergency was lifted and elections were conducted in the country, in which the government of Mrs. Gandhi lost and the Janta Party won. The leader of the Janta Party was Mr. Morarji Desai, who led the Nav Nirman Andolan in Gujarat and became the Prime Minister of India in 1977. As soon as Mr. Morarji Desai came into power, he constituted a commission called the Shah Commission. In this commission, the atrocities, injustices, and human rights violations that took place during the emergency were to be investigated to find out, why was the emergency declared? What were the reasons behind it? What was the impact of the emergency? The laws and the rights that were made during the emergency and passed in Parliament were right or wrong? The investigation of all those things was handed over to the Shah Commission. Later, when the investigation reports came, it was discovered that the government of Mrs. Indira Gandhi did not have any concrete reason to declare an emergency. It was only done for the benefit of their political careers. Hence, all the cases were filed against the government of Mrs. Indira Gandhi. But before any action was taken against these people, the government of Mr. Morarji Desai, that is, the Janta Party, fell and the government of Mrs. Gandhi came back into power. As soon as they came into power, they dismissed the entire matter of the emergency. So, this was the history of the event of emergency in India. If you got to know and learn something from this video, then like and share this video. Moreover, tell us in the comments how you liked the video. We will keep bringing you more historical videos. Thank you for your time.